I'm very happy to be here today with you. So when Francisca asked me to present something about introduction to psychiatric disorders, I say, okay, I will do it, challenge accepted, but please be nice with me. So this is my slide of disclosure. And when we are speaking about psychiatry, maybe most of you are imagining that psychiatrists are like officing in this kind of office, like it was the office of Jacques Lacan, which is a famous psychiatrist. We can criticize him a lot, but at least he was a psychiatrist in Paris. And the office of Lacan was like that, with a sofa for the patient, and it's totally different now when we are doing like psychiatric examination for a patient, because we did face-to-face interview now. And the problem of psychiatry is that we don't have any validated biomarkers to say that this is obviously this kind of disease, and we have to refer to the interview and to the speak of the patient. And patient can have subjective complaints, and it's hard sometimes to differentiate what is really the problem of a patient, or just a complaint that is only subjective without real symptoms behind that. Especially when people have behavioral problems, and sometimes they are unaware of the trouble they can have, and that's hard to disentangle what is a subjective complaint and what is the real symptoms. Especially in psychiatry, symptoms are unspecific, so it's sometimes very hard to make a diagnosis for a patient. For example, if a patient comes with an anxiety, it can be anxiety disorder by itself, or it can be anxiety in another disease like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression. So it's hard sometimes to have a clear diagnosis with only one or two symptoms that are unspecific. But some of symptoms are objective. You can see here it's not the office of Jacques Lacan, it's a room of a patient with suffering from a warding disorder and just accumulate a lot of stuff in his apartment. So you can have some objective symptoms, and you can assess that as a psychiatrist. For example, see if the physical presentation is weird for a patient, if there is soft neglect, especially for not taking baths or something. And there is also some objective clues like nonverbal communication. If a patient does not meet your eyes during the interview, for example, you can ask if it's only anxiety or if it's also a question of autistic feature. And some of the patient can be also diagnosed based on the decrease in social functioning. Imagine that you have a patient that is a child, he functions well, he performs well at school, and during adolescence he has a decrease in social functioning. You can be at least wondering if it's not a psychiatric disorder that starts during adolescence. So we have some objective symptoms also in psychiatry. But psychiatry is a diagnosis of exclusion. When a patient comes with the symptoms, most of the time we have to look if it's not better explained by another disease. So we have decision trees, and we need to see if the symptoms is included in another medical condition that will be better explaining the phenotype. For example, if a patient comes with psychotic symptoms and fever, we can sometimes assess if it's not a neurological disorder, like meningitis, for example. So psychiatric disorder can be secondary to a medical disease. That's new findings and new, now well-accepted stuff in our field. But we also have to check if another condition that is treatable is not better explained in the phenotype, because we can refer the patient to a different specialty medical doctor. And to complexify the process, psychiatric disorders are dynamic. There is a change during the development. A patient comes with a vulnerability during early adolescence, and you can also see in late adolescence the development of some unspecific and substressal symptoms. Like, for example, in schizophrenia, you have a phase that is called at-risk mental state, where the patient can experiment some substressal symptoms, like attenuated psychotic symptoms. They can have distortion, illusion, perceptual illusion, or sometimes of delusion, but they can criticize the delusion. And usually at the late adolescence, You can have a first episode of the disease, like a psychotic episode, and then you can have relapse and chronicity. So psychiatric disorders are dynamic, and if you assess only one time for a patient, you can make the wrong diagnosis. So psychiatric disorders are sometimes with unspecific symptoms. Some of symptoms can be objective, but the psychiatric disorders are dynamic, so it makes the diagnosis sometimes very complicated to do. But if we look at the reliability of our diagnosis, that's quite good. If you look at the kappa coefficient, which is a ratio between the interrate agreement minus the agreement occurring by chance divided by 1 minus the agreement occurring by chance, you have a pretty good reliability of your psychotic diagnosis, especially for PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, for bipolar disorder, for schizophrenia. We have a good inter-rater agreement. So why is it so good if we have some unspecific symptoms, and it's hard to diagnose the psychiatric disorder, but we have a good agreement? Why? That's thanks to the standardization of the diagnosis that occurred like 50 years ago or 60 years ago. It's a long story of finding some agreement between experts in the field to standardize the diagnosis. And this is the work done by the DSM since 1962, so after the war. And until now, because we have the 5th edition of the manual, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder. And you can say that the author claims that this is a product of more than 10 years of effort just for the last version of the DSM by hundreds of international experts. And the DSM aim, I don't know if it does, but at least it aims to define and classify categorical disorder in order to improve diagnosis, treatment, and research. So this is a manual for diagnosis, categorical diagnosis. So what kind of diagnosis we can have in this manual? So for example, for schizophrenia, it is very, very detailed in symptoms to check. If you need to have 2 or more of the following symptoms for at least 1 month or longer period of time, and at least one of them must be 1, 2, or 3 through the list. So for example, you may have delusion, hallucination, or disorganized speech. One of these symptoms should be present, and one of the others can also be present, like grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior, negative symptoms. And another criteria is also the impairment in the functioning. That's exactly what I said just before, that functioning is important to take into account for diagnosis. And the duration is also codified by the DSM, so symptoms must be present during more than 6 months to be diagnosed as schizophrenia. So I don't want to list every disease like that, and for being more fancy, I propose to show you some paintings from the patient. Because we have here in St. Anne Hospital a museum of art and history, and we can see some paintings from patients that have been hospitalized here in St. Anne through many, many years. So just to illustrate the delusion of a patient, I would like to show you this picture. This is a painting made by Gaston Duff, which is a guy that was absolutely no artistic background before being hospitalized when he was 20 years old. After several years, the psychiatrist found some of this painting, but he hidden this painting in his clothes. So maybe he has accumulated a lot of paintings, maybe he has burned some of them, but at least we saved some of them, and we can now expose them to the museum. In 1953, the patient suddenly gave up drawing. He just answered to this question, why did you give up the painting? He said, I shouldn't draw. That's it. That's an example of an emetic speech. You cannot understand why the patient is doing that, but he has like maybe a delusion about that, he shouldn't draw. To illustrate the negative symptoms, I showed this picture made by Pascal Duff. This artist dropped out school at 13 years old and started taking specialized painting course. And you can see how it illustrates now the negative symptoms like with social withdrawal and apathy. And he continued painting and drawing during episode of illness. And for this organization, I can illustrate that by this painting that is anonymous. This you can see that something in the brain is wrong with this guy, and the socks are going outside the brain. And that's sometimes the feeling that can have the patient when there is like an entangle of socks, or they can have some contradictory affect or contradictory socks, and it's really perfectly illustrated by this picture. Sometimes we can ask the patient if the socks are like unclear for him. He can say yes, but also sometimes you can assess that by the behavior. If the behavior is disorganized, at the moment you can be maybe a hypothesis that this is due to disorganization of socks. So for major depressive disorder, we have the same kind of symptoms, the same kind of items to check. So including like depression, depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day, and anhedonia. Anhedonia is a reduction of pleasure, and a reduction of pleasure to do activities that were before really enjoying for the patient. We need at least one of these symptoms and other symptoms among a list of symptoms. And I just want to show you this picture made by Amy Wilde, which was a ballerina and moved to painting in the second part of her life. And she was hospitalized without any very clear diagnosis in St. Anne Hospital. But you can see, at least in this painting, that there is a loneliness. You can see here the small house in the middle of the tree without any leaves. And you see that it's like in black, white, and gray color. So it must illustrate like the depressing mood. And you also have to check if there is sometimes some suicidal idea, because you have a lot of suicidal thoughts in depression. The suicidality is not only present in depression, it's present in a lot of disease, a lot of condition, but this is what we absolutely need to check for patients with depressive mood. Then we can move to bipolar disorder. When you have a patient with depression, it can be only one episode, or it can be a recurrence of different episodes, or it can be sometimes a depression predating the onset of a bipolar disorder with mania, for example, or hypomania, which is a less level of mania. And this kind of presentation is alternating between different episodes, depression and mania. In mania, you have euphoric states with increase of energy, increase of the speed of the thoughts. So this can be illustrated in this painting, where you see a lot of color, like yellow, red, and also in the face of the guy, which is painted here. You can see one part of the face is red, one part of the face is blue. So this is something that can be produced by a patient, especially in manic episodes. Patients are very productive. We have some patients that paint a lot, including during the night, and then can burn them or destroy all the paintings they have done. For anxiety, anxiety is transdiagnostic, and you can assess it by looking at the behavior of the patient. If a patient, for example, is biting his hand or checking or something like that, you can be sure that maybe there is anxiety, and you have to check that. And anxiety can be a disorder by itself. It's several psychiatric disorders, like post-traumatic stress disorder, like generalized anxiety, and it can be also part of other disease. For example, in bipolar disorder, approximately 1 to 2/3 of the patient can also suffer by comorbid anxiety disorder. Anorexia, I just want to say one word of anorexia, because you may have heard of it, of course. It's a patient with a reduction of weight, with a restriction of food, or sometimes vomiting. And you have a poster specifically on anorexia made by a colleague from the Institute of Psychiatry. You can also discuss with him if you want. It's in the room, it's Nicolas Ramos. Autism, we speak a lot about autism this morning, and I chose this picture to illustrate it because it's an impairment in the social interaction. And this painting illustrates patients interacting together, patient reading a newspaper, sometimes for people with suffering from autistic spectrum disorder, it's hard to join this kind of social interaction. They can have a decrease in the interaction, but also in the looking in the eyes process. We speak a lot about that this morning, so I will not develop more this disease. These diseases are quite stressful for the patient, and sometimes they can be pushed to have some disorder in behavior, or to take drink, or to drink a lot, or to take other drugs, or like cannabis, for example, that can also worsen the symptoms sometimes. And that's a big challenge now to disentangle dual disorder with both psychiatric disorders and drug consumption, because drug can worsening the symptoms, and psychiatric disorder can force the patient to take drugs. So what we learn of everything like that, or what are we talking about? We're talking about a continuum or an overlap between different diseases. And now it's pretty clear that we have a gradient of neurodevelopmental pathology through intellectual disability to autism, schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, which is a mix between schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, and bipolar at the end of the spectrum, and mood disorder like depression. And at the same time, we also have a gradient of affective pathology. Some of the patients can be at the crossroad between affective pathology and neurodevelopmental pathology. And there is several kinds of symptoms, like cognitive impairment, negative symptoms. Positive symptoms means that symptoms that are productive, like delusion, hallucination, or mood symptoms that can be like on the gradient. And we are just at the beginning to understanding the interaction between gene and environment, and to try to find some circuitry in the brain that could explain this range of symptoms. These genes are hard to identify because they can code for many functions. That's called a pleiotropy. And the genes can be, for example, involved in mood disorder because it's making this kind of cells like unhealthy, and be in favor also in schizophrenia because he is involved in other process. So, but we are trying now to disentangle all the genetic architecture of this disease. And we know that the different diseases on this gradient can sometimes respond to the same treatment. For example, if we gave antipsychotic to a patient with schizophrenia, which is recommended, we can also give sometimes antipsychotic to bipolar disorder with psychotic feature, or to increase the efficiency of antidepressant medication. So we have sometimes the same treatment for different disorders in psychiatry. So what makes this thing so complicated is that this is a lot of overlap like that, and we are trying to disentangle clinically and also etiologically this overlap. So DSM is maybe not a good way to do that because it's very categorical and it's based on expert consensus. And now people are suggesting that we should move to another kind of classification with the Airdoc, which is the Research Domain Criteria Initiative promoted by the NIMH. And Airdoc is supposed to be more dimensional and biologically valid than the DSM. It's supposed to, they aim to be more biologically valid. We will discuss that if you want. And the DSM, in the same time, is maintained by the American Psychiatric Association. So there is a debate inside the psychiatric field to promote one or the others of the model. And people wanting to promote Airdoc are saying that Airdoc is an attempt to create a new kind of taxonomy for mental disorders by bridging the power of modern research approach in genetics, neuroscience, and behavioral science to the problem of mental illness. And what are the domains of the Airdoc? The domain have been chosen by the experts, and they choose like 6 domains. There was 5 before, and now they add another one. That maybe will be please the child psychiatrist, because the last domain is sensory motor systems, and this is to make sense to some learning disability like dyspraxia and so. So negative valence systems like anxiety, fear, positive valence system are also another domain. Sensitivity to reward balanced by effort. Cognitive systems with working memory, attention, neurocognitive disorders can be entering in this category. System for social processes, we refer to autism spectrum disorder here, theory of mind, facial communication, there is several dimensions inside. Arousal or regulatory systems are mainly driven by circadian rhythms and insomnia. And so this is the model for positive valence system. And so you can have an overview here of what are the constructs inside the domain. For example, reward anticipation, reward satiation, reward prediction error, delay, sensibility to effort. And they also claim that they have different arguments inside the construct to have an idea that, for example, initial response to reward is due to certain molecules or is modified by certain molecules, or it is encoded by certain circuits in the brain or related to some behavior. And before that, there was in this different constructs, there was a list of circuits, physiology, behavior, molecules, but there was also a list of genes. But finally, the authors recently start to remove this list of genes. And they said, as in May 2017, we remove reference to specific genes from the genes column in the Airdoc matrix. We recognize the clear relevance of investigating genomic aspect of Airdoc constructs and domain. However, the current state of the field emphasizes the need for robust evidence of association, generally resulting from adequately powered genome-wide association studies as opposed to candidate gene approach. As we actively reevaluate the specifics of information to be included in the column, the Airdoc matrix will be updated accordingly. So they remove knowledge based on genetics in the matrix because they acknowledge that the knowledge about genetic correlation of this kind of construct and domain are not valid for the moment, but they ask for providing more information through the GWAS information. And this is ongoing because now we can have GWAS for a large number of traits. For example, if you go to the UK Biobank data and you can go online to this website, you can, for each gene you want or each SNP you have, you can test if there is a specific domain that is corresponding. So we can do like classical GWAS like that. If you look for prospective memory results in this database, you will find some genes like all the genes that are upper than the threshold level for significance. But you can do the reverse with PheWAS, phenome-wide association studies. You can enter genes and you can find what are the best phenotype associated with the genes. For example, I have this very interesting polymorphism I found in a previous study, and I look if it's associated in the UK Biobank with some specific phenotype, and it's associated on less than the threshold p-value, but it's a tendency of association with age-complete full-time education, which is a proxy of IQ. So we can do the reverse now, and so we hope that in the next few years we will be able to identify some genes involving in the different dimensional phenotype. So let's finish with the relevance of genetics for psychiatric practice. With Francisca, we maybe some of you here in the room, we are been involved in the revision of the genetic testing statement from the International Society of Psychiatric Genetics. And what are the take-home message of this statement? It's online. If you want to check it, it's really helpful and informative. First, the polygenic risk scores informed by GWAS are currently considered research analysis and are not recommended for clinical use. So for a psychiatrist today, we don't have to use the data from the GWAS to make a diagnosis of a patient or to predict the onset of a disease. That's a very, very clear statement. Maybe in the future, thanks to the advance of more integrative scores or to the development of bigger GWAS, we can maybe have an interesting findings, but for the moment, we cannot use the GWAS data to individually predict something for the patient. It's only relevant for a large population. The second point is that whole exome sequencing studies have also identified genes that contribute to a broad spectrum of neurodevelopmental and adult onset psychiatric disorders. You have just an example this morning with the large number of genes involved in autism spectrum disorder. We estimate now that approximately one quarter to 25% of patients with ISD, autism spectrum disorder, can have a molecular diagnosis based on their DNA. It's less for other diseases, like in schizophrenia, we have very few cases, but we have some, and that can be interesting. And the statement says that pathogenic variants that disrupt these genes in an individual with schizophrenia can be regarded as significant contributory risk factors, even in the absence of comorbid ID, developmental delay, or ISD, or autism spectrum disorder. It means that now we are moving to identify some genes with pathogenic variants, including schizophrenia. But this can be more interesting in clinical practice is that we also can have CNV, and this CNV, copy number variant, can be useful to also make a molecular diagnosis in schizophrenia. And the committee did not reach consensus of the use of CNV, but that could be helpful to understand and accept the diagnosis for a patient. So just briefly, and I will finish by that, what is the interest of performing genetic tests in a patient? And just an introduction of what we will see later. You can reduce the stigma. If a patient has a mutation somewhere, you can say it's not your fault, you are not guilty, it's because of your DNA or because of something that is like increasing your risk to psychotic disorder. You can perform genetic counseling, and I'm glad we have Brenda Finucane that will introduce that today. And we now can also hope to prevent the comorbidity. For example, you find a deletion, a 20q11 deletion, we have to check as a psychiatrist if the patient has also a cardiac defect. And the hope is to develop specific treatment, and we will have a presentation tomorrow by Maite Taubert about the development of a new treatment in Prader-Willi syndrome. So my hope is that the next few years we will develop precision medicine in psychiatry. We are like between here and here. We are just coming with a new set of variants that can be identified in the population with psychiatric disorder. And the hope is that now we can disentangle this patient based on their genetic background, redefining the disorders based on that, and redefining the way to treat them and adapt the treatment. I just finished with some acknowledgement, of course, for my colleagues, for the patient, for the families, for the Center of Reference for Rare Disease, and for you to your attention. Thank you.